Okay, so let's bring in the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor now. Angus, good morning, good to see you. So you had Labor's argument back then in 2016, so why is it different now?
They're breaking an election promise, Pete. There's no ambiguity about that. They're legislating this in this term of Parliament, and this is a supersized broken election promise. It was unambiguous from the Prime Minister. They weren't going to make changes to superannuation. This is a trifecta. He promised lower electricity prices. He's walked away from that. He's promised cheaper mortgages. He's walked away from that. And he promised not to change the superannuation tax arrangements, and he's now walking away from that. Now, where does it go next? This is a slippery slope. We saw $150 billion of tax increase opportunities laid out by the government yesterday. The Treasurer has refused to rule out capital gains tax on the family home, taxing the family home. Negative gearing this morning, refused to rule that out.
Yeah, no, we'll get to that. I do want to ask you on that point that you made in 2016, though, because even though it was an election promise that you made, the argument was still there. People should pay their fair share of tax. So what? Sure. You obviously got a different view now. So what made you change your position?
Well, that's a different policy, but the far more important point is this is a broken election promise.
No, but I get that, but I'm just going back to what you're saying, though. But what's behind you changing your view?
Labor's breaking an election promise.
What about you changing your view, though? Pete, I know you want to move it on because it's awkward, but what made you change your view?
I'll talk about it all day, Pete. Labor is breaking an election promise. Albanese said, "My word is my bond." The Prime Minister is walking away from his word before the election. He seems to think what he says before an election no longer matters.
Okay,
well, it does matter to the Australian people because it affects them.
The point that you were making in 2016 is that the uber rich should be able to pay their fair share of tax just like everybody else is. So why don't you have that view in 2023?
Well, I have the view that the government shouldn't break their election promises, Pete. And I would have thought the media and the press gallery would think that's pretty important too. I
put that to Jim Chalmers earlier today.
A strongly held view around here in the past.
I did put that to Jim Chalmers earlier.
Can I come back to another point you just made?
Okay,
Can I come back to another point you just made? And it's an important point. Labor is saying this is not going to affect many Australians. This is deeply misleading. It is deeply misleading because the Treasurer has done something very tricky here. He said that this threshold will not be indexed. Now, we've got inflation running hot in this country, almost 8%. And that means in real terms, that threshold will come down dramatically and very quickly. And it'll affect far more Australians than they're saying. They haven't laid out how it will affect those on defined benefits. That includes veterans. It includes the Prime Minister himself. But it is clear that the impact will be much broader and a much bigger attack on middle Australia over time than they are pretending in what they say. Now, the reason this is so important is we invest over many decades in superannuation. It's not a short-term thing, it's a long-term thing. And so the value of people's accounts changes greatly, and the value of this threshold will change greatly as inflation continues to have an impact, Pete. And so Labor needs to be upfront with the Australian people about how many people this will affect over time. And the reality is it will be many, many Australians.
Did you truly believe what you were saying in 2016?
Of course, of course I did, Pete. But the point I was making
so why don't you have that
and I'll
belief
continue
now?
to make now is that governments should keep election commitments. Governments should keep election commitments. Now, that went to an election. And it was a hard-fought election. This is not going to an election. Labor is proposing to legislate this in this term of Parliament.
No, I get that. So you will fight the government on this at the next election?
We will fight against this going through the Parliament. We will make the point consistently that Anthony Albanese cannot be trusted. This government cannot be trusted. When it says it's going to do something, you never know whether that's what it's going to do. Not only have they broken that trifecta of election promises I just talked about, they've given us a range of surprises we didn't expect before the election, like moving to industry-wide bargaining, toxic industrial relations environment being reintroduced. So This is a Prime Minister and this is a government that says one thing and does another after the election.
Why take on something...
The Australian people...
Why take on something so fiercely that only affects the uber wealthy and such a small percentage of the population?
Well, because it doesn't affect such a small percentage.
I mean, but 80,000, I know you made the point that it'll increase over time.
Well,
I mean, all things considered, that's a small section of the population.
Einstein said there's few forces more powerful in life than compounding, and you will see compounding over time.
No, I get that. But still,
this threshold will come down. Well, let's see. Australia needs to be up. The government needs to be upfront with Australians about how many people will be affected over time. You know, you've got people in their 20s and 30s investing now for retirement in 40 years' time. Pete, this threshold will be substantially lower,
and there are increases
in 40 years' time in real terms. You know, and with an economy where inflation's running hot, we've got a government that doesn't know how to get it under control. It is very clear that threshold will be substantially lower in a relatively short period of time and will impact many more.
So you will try, if you win the next election, you will fight to roll it back. You promise to roll it back?
Well, we'll take our policies to the next election and announce them before the next election.
Will you roll it back? I mean, you're fighting so fiercely now. Does that mean you're going to roll it back?
Well, as I say, we'll take our policies to the next election and you'll know about them in good time. What I'm saying is we're going to oppose this in this term of the parliament because that is when it's being introduced. This is not about the next election. This is another misleading Labor assertion. It's about legislation that is going through the parliament in this term, Pete.
Jim Chalmers, I put all these questions to him earlier, and he denies that there's going to be changes, and we know that language can change. He denies there's going to be changes on capital gains tax on the family home, trusts and negative gearing. What makes you so sure that there's going to be movement in that space?
Who says that, Pete?
So this is Jim Chalmers, my chat with the Treasurer earlier.
Well, he needs to rule it out unambiguously. The Prime Minister refused to rule out taxing negative gearing in an interview he's just done a short time ago. They need to get on the same page. Are they going to rule out taxing the family home? Are they going to rule out taxing negative gearing? Are they going to rule out the $150 billion of tax options they released yesterday? I mean, they need to be clear with the Australian people. The sad reality is, even if they do rule these things out, it's not clear now that this government can be trusted when it comes to tax because they said they weren't going to tax superannuation and now they're taxing it, Pete. So what they say, you know, Albanese said, my word is my bond before the last election. It's a pretty weak bond, that one, because the truth of the matter is his word seems to be worth nothing now. He's walking away from critical election commitments he made that really matter to Australians, you know, walking away from his electricity price reduction. These things don't seem to matter to Labor once they've won an election. Well, they do matter to the Australian people. And the priorities of this government need to return to being the priorities of the Australian people.
Angus Taylor, good to see you.
Good day.
Well, have a good day. Talk to you soon.